My contribution to Heritage Open Days is to talk about the relationship between the houses on the High Street in Lowestoft and the Deans. So if we could start with the High Street, there's a view up there of number 4, and moving northwards, number 3 and number 2, the chimney stacks of one which can be seen. They are the northern extremity of houses in the High Street, and residences on that spot date back to the first half of the 14th century, when the town moved from an earlier site somewhere in what we would now call the Normanston Cemetery, came onto the cliff for a combination of reasons between 1300 and 1350, and in that time people created a whole new town while carrying on the traditional industries of farming and fishing. If we can turn to fishing, the Deans then assume considerable importance. There's a limited view from here, but enough to be relevant to what I'm saying. The Deans were, before the harbour was built 1827 to 1830, a large open-air wharf, an area for the rough grazing of livestock at fees charged under the manor, and also an area for the servicing and repair of fishing gear, which local people had free, and any visiting fishermen from other parts of England paid a certain toll. The Deans today are roughly 200 yards, 200 metres wide from Wapload Road to the sea wall. They were once much wider than that. A military survey of May 1545 describes them as 42 tailors' yards wide. And if you bring a tailor's yard at 42 inches into modern calculation, you're looking at a distance of width on the Deans of something like 800 yards, 800 metres, around about half a mile. So over the length of, what, 450 years or more, 3/4 of the Deans have been lost to the sea. And the area is now fixed by concrete sea defences and hopefully will not diminish any further. Between the extremities of the Deans, and we don't know whether this military survey measurement was carried out from the foot of the cliff or from Wapload Road. That's not known, but it doesn't really matter. The intervening element between Deans and High Street is the cliff. What on earth do you do with a cliff 60 to 70 degrees of slope, compounded of soft sands and clays, glacial deposits? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to make it usable? Well, the answer is you terrace it. And Lowestoft Cliff, from where the houses start, and you can't see it from here because of the tree growth, but if you walk on some of the scores and look over the walls, you can see the terraces. There are 3 terraces at this end, and by the time you get down to the Triangle Market and the ground starts to slope away down Old Nelson Street, it reduces to 2 terraces and then one at the very bottom where the roundabout is, where Wapload Road joins Battery Green Road, joins Old Nelson Street. There was probably just the 1 terrace there. At the higher end of the High Street, the terrace at the back of the house was used as a general storage and dumping area for waste, which was then disposed of either into the scores themselves or into the High Street. And that broke the laws of the manor, and people who did it were fined, usually about 2pence, 3pence or 4pence. And if you study the manor books, the same people are dumping their rubbish every damn year and paying the fine. The second terrace down was often a garden of sorts, almost like an amenity area. But also there were sometimes buildings to do with maritime enterprise and fishing. And certainly the lowest level of all was given over to places for the storage of salt, for the storage of gear, and for the smoking of herrings into red herrings. And this brings me on now to a link between Deans and the High Street, which is the building in front of us here, black tarred on the northern face as we look at it. You can't see it all, but you'll detect a change in roof line between the easternmost section and the one to the west of it. And beyond the trees, there's a smaller building with a lower roof line, which is in fact a mid-17th century salt store, probably built after the fire of 1645, followed at a later date by the 2 main buildings, which were built, as I say, as smokehouses. They were converted at some point during the 19th century into a net store, where fishing gear was stored on the lower part, the ground floor level, and then a floor was put in to make an upper section where the women largely, and young girls, possibly some men as well supervising, they actually mended and made up fishing nets. The women become known as beatsters at some point. I don't think anyone's ever tracked down the origin of the word in the sense of giving it a precise date. It comes from an Old English word, beat, B-E-E-T or B-E-A-T, and it means to mend. And in fact, an early English translation of the Bible done by John Wycliffe in the late 14th century refers to Christ coming upon some of the apostles after the resurrection by the Sea of Galilee, and it refers to them as beating nets. So there's a very, very good pedigree for that word. Putting a floor in for the beatsters to walk on meant taking out all the smoking racks. They've all been cut through, but at roof level, under the gable slope, they've been left intact from it. Talking about the surviving smoke racks under the roof pitch, they are a precious survival, and I would argue strongly for the building that you're looking at, which seems to be in pretty bad repair really. That building is now Grade 2 listed to save anything bad happening to it. It needs to be saved. The only realistic way of doing it is to find a use for it. It's a remarkable building. The smoke racks inside in the roof are really wonderful examples of timber framing of the time to serve a functional use. And when you think that they dropped the whole way to the floor and that people used to climb up them to put the racks of herrings across, you know, I don't know what the risk was of falling off, but I would imagine that one or two people probably took a tumble. That's a precious building, and it's the one that I've chosen to focus on. It's a link between the top of the cliff, where largely the merchants lived. The richer people, the merchants who owned the vessels that went fishing and that conducted maritime trade with much of northwestern Europe, as far as the end of the Baltic. Riga, the present capital of Latvia, is among the places that Lowestoft vessels went to with fish and grain and possibly malt on board, and then they would come back with softwood timber, with pig iron, with resin, pitch, and also with hemp to make the quality of ropes that were needed for maritime activity. Lowestoft did grow its own hemp in town, hence the name the Hemplands at the northern end, but it wasn't sufficient to make good strong rope from. It was used to make linen, and Lowestoft did in the 16th and early 17th century have a considerable number of linen weavers among its population. The big houses on the cliff and on the west side of the high street, merchants, big innkeepers, people involved in business activities of other kinds, and then in a series of cross lanes, starting with Mariner Street at the northern end and with Duke's Head Street at the bottom, lived the less well-off members of the population in much smaller houses, in what is in fact a grid layout, deliberately contrived so you could get small houses in small plots and house your working population. So there is a definite social geography to be seen in Lowestoft High Street, ascertainable in all kinds of records if you take the trouble to look. Just as a slight departure, to take the story further forward in time, during the second half of the 18th century, Lowestoft became a notable local resort for people who wish to take the waters, and that means sea bathing and also drinking the stuff for medicinal purposes. It all started really with the formation of what were called assembly rooms in Compass Street on the south side, where the new row of houses stands opposite the town hall site. There was an inn there called the Queen's Head, and it had assembly rooms built which butted onto the back wall which separated it from the Crown, and that was the place for local people of wealth and distinction to meet periodically, to socialise. Balls were held there, different functions, games of cards, and once that politeness, as it's called, was established in the town, it was followed very, very soon afterwards by the arrival of bathing machines on the North Beach in the 1760s. And from then on, Lowestoft became very much a place of resort. And the row of houses you see on the cliff, the middle one, number 3 High Street, was actually built by a member of the Sloane family, who still own the Sloane Square area of London, that part of Chelsea I suppose you'd call it. This was Charles Sloane, the 3rd Baron Cadogan, who had a high quality seaside residence built, and it's up there immediately to the north of number 4 High Street, of which you see the bulk. Among the visitors who came to Lowestoft during that period is James Woodford, the famous rector of Weston Longville near Dereham in Norfolk, who kept one of the great clergy diaries of the 18th century, which has been published in different formats over a long number of years. He came with a nephew from Lowestoft one midday. He'd been at Southwold in the morning, and he didn't rate Southwold at all. He thought it a very poor place in comparison with Lowestoft. How would we judge the two today, I wonder? But never mind. He spent the afternoon perambulating with his nephew over on the Denes, taking in the local scene and the sea air and having a good time, and then departing late in the evening for his native Western Longville. And it's little pieces like these that help to build up a composite picture of Lowestoft history over the centuries. And it's possible, in a small way, to bridge the gap by immersing yourself in affairs of the time. In conclusion, I'd like to pick up something I've referred to earlier, which is how the town shifted from somewhere in the northern sector of what we know as the Normanston Municipal Cemetery, possibly around the chapel area there, is where the village stood at one time, and it's the meeting point of two of the great common fields where agriculture was practiced, the southwest field and the south field. Part of the southwest field still survives in Normanston Park, and it's the only really unbuilt bit of medieval Lowestoft that you can hang your hat on as being something like it possibly was. Open in aspect, yes, grassed over now instead of growing crops. The third of the common fields, because there were always three, you cropped two one year and rested the other one to recover, and then you rested one that had been under agriculture, so you were on a 3-year cycle. The other one was the north field, which was to the north of St Margaret's Road, and which Northfield Primary School was named after. Now, what do you do if you need to move your town? But first of all, why do you need to move your town? Well, the late 13th, early 14th century was a time of rising sea levels. A rise in sea levels and consequent ingress of water at certain times would have made life difficult for the people of the village, because although they were higher up a slope and above flood level, the bottom end of what we now call Rotterdam Road was an area called Seath Marsh, which was used for all kinds of things. They would have used the reed to thatch houses with, they would have cut sedge for use indoors, they probably would have trapped wildfowl and almost certainly have taken coarse fish for their diet. Now, if that's regularly flooding, it's going to make it very, very difficult to use. So there's one possible motivation to move the town. Another is that the late 13th, early 14th century was a time of increasing population over the whole of England. And if the Lowestoft village population was growing, which it almost certainly is on slender evidential records of the time, that's another reason for moving. You can't really expand your village into valuable agricultural land which you need to feed the population. And then finally, by the early 14th century, the early 1300s, Lowestoft was increasing its maritime activity significantly, particularly fishing, but also maritime trade to a lesser extent. And it needed to be nearer the beach. And those are the three reasons why the people, I think, the chief tenants of the manor, took it upon themselves to get the town moved. Lowestoft never had a resident lord of the manor who lived in the town, which meant that the local people had considerable autonomy. As long as they paid their rents, the steward of the manor would be happy to pass them on to the lord, and the lord would be happy to receive the income. And the lord of the manor of the early 14th century, John de Dreux, Earl of Brittany, nephew of Edward I, he sanctioned the move of the town. I can't prove it conclusively, but I'm pretty certain that he did. And over about a 50-year period, the town moved itself from the earlier site onto the cliff, terracing the cliff as previously described into 3, 2, 1 stages as you went from the high ground at the north to the lower ground at the south. How on earth did they do it, and yet still continue with agriculture and fishing, their main pursuits? Did they bring in outside labour to help? Everybody must have worked. Men, women, children. No JCBs in those days, just shovels and baskets to shift the spoil. And once you've terraced the cliff, you've got to maintain the terraces by putting in retaining walls, which were timber to start with. This was proved by a dig at the back of 80 High Street in the early 2000s, and then later replaced by brick. And the scores, of course, which give access to the beach from the top of the cliff, they were originally surface water runnels down the face of the cliff, which people use as paths, and then eventually when the town moved, they were properly managed. They were stepped, and steps put in after a while, and they had retaining walls, probably timber to start with, and again masonry later on, which is what we see today. And if you want to see embryonic scores in the making, go on to Gunton Cliff and walk from there through the gorse, and there are about 2 or 3 scores in the making, which are water drainage channels which people do use, as well as the steps that are provided, as means of getting to and from the beach. Practical living history.